They put my husband in the ground on a Tuesday, and Harlan Pike came for my land on the following Saturday. I have thought about those 4 days more than any others in my life, because they are the days I learned that grief does not buy you mercy. Out here on the lawn, the dry, flat roof of Texas where the wind never stops talking, nobody gives you time to bleed. The drought had been on us 2 years by then. The grass had gone the color of old bone, the creeks had quit, and the only living water for 30 miles in any direction came up cold and clear from the spring on the ranch my Daniel and I had built with our own 4 hands. That spring was why Harlan Pike walked into the Caldwell Springs courthouse with a leather ledger under his arm and a smile like a snake easing out from under a porch. I was wearing black still. I remember the clerk would not look at me. Pike opened his ledger on the judge's table and laid one thick finger on a line of figures and said, in that soft preacher's voice he used when he was about to take something from somebody, that my late husband had signed a note against the property. $2,000 borrowed against the deed, due in full, and the ranch and the spring as collateral. I told him Daniel never borrowed a dime from any man, that he hated debt the way other men hated rattlesnakes. Pike smiled wider and turned the ledger toward me. There was Daniel's name in ink. I knew my husband's hand better than I knew my own, and that signature was close. It was very close. But the sea in Callaway had a little tail Daniel never made, and I felt the floor tilt under me, because I understood then that this was not a debt. It was a hanging, and they had already built the gallows. The clerk cleared his throat and read the territorial statute the way a man reads a sentence. A widow holding property could not refuse a lawful debt. She could pay it, which I could not, or she could forfeit, or she could marry within 10 days a man willing to assume the note and stand good for it. Pike had thought of everything. He even had a man for me. His own foreman, Vernon Tate, was standing in the back of the room with his hat in his hands, and his eyes crawling over me like I was a heifer at auction. Mary Tate, the law said in so many words, and the debt would be folded quietly into Pike's holdings, and the spring would be his, and I would be a thing that came with the deed. There was one other man in that courtroom, leaning against the wall by the door where the light could not reach his face. Levi Hart. He had hired on 3 weeks before Daniel died, drifting through, asking for fence work and asking no questions and answering fewer. He had a scar that ran from his right ear down into his collar, pale and old, and a way of standing so still you forgot he was there until he moved. The judge said Hart had agreed to assume the note if I would have him. I turned and looked at this stranger the town had picked out for me like a horse, and I asked him what he had been promised. He said, in a voice that did not get much use, "Nothing, ma'am. A chance to stop drifting." That was the first time Levi Hart ever spoke to me, and I hated him a little for it because he was the only honest thing in the room. I rode home alone that day, and I did not cry until I was past the last fence and out of sight of the town, and then I cried hard enough to scare my horse. Daniel had promised me this land would always be mine. He used to stand on the porch in the evening and say the spring would outlast us both, that water like that was a gift you only got to keep if you were good to it. Now a forged signature was going to take it, and the law was holding the door open. When I crested the rise and saw the ranch laid out below me, the low house Daniel built, the windmill, the green ribbon of mesquite that followed the spring branch through all that dead grass, I made up my mind. I would not sell to Pike. I would not marry his foreman. I would rather marry the silent stranger with the scar than hand my husband's water to the man who had forged his name. Cyrus, my foreman, was waiting at the gate. He had been with us since the first winter, an old man with a face like a saddle and a loyalty I never deserved. When I told him what had happened, he spat in the dust and called Harlan Pike a word I will not repeat, and then he said the hands would make a stand, that nobody would take the spring while they were drawing breath. I told him no. I told him I would not have men dying over water and ink. There was a better way, even if it tasted like poison going down. Cyrus looked at me a long time. Then he asked which way that was. I said I supposed I was getting married, and even Preacher, the one-eyed mule tied to the corral rail, turned his head and brayed like he had an opinion about it. That evening Vernon Tate came to the porch with whiskey on his breath and a bunch of wilting flowers to make his own offer before the wedding could happen. He told me a woman alone could not work a spread like this. He told me Pike would forgive the whole debt if I came to him willing, and that I was too fine a thing to waste on a scarred drifter. I let him talk until he reached for my hand, and then I had Daniel's shotgun off the wall and leveled at his belt buckle before he finished the reach. I told him my husband taught me to shoot the eye out of a jackrabbit at 50 yards, and that he was a sight bigger than a jackrabbit. Tate backed off the porch and down the steps, and he told me I was making an enemy, that Hart had nothing but trouble in his saddlebags and I was a fool to take him. Then he got on his horse and rode for Pike's, and I stood there shaking, the shotgun heavy in my arms, and I thought, I have made 2 enemies in one day, and I am not even married yet. Levi Hart came that night of his own accord, his horse tied loose at the rail, his hat in his hands. He had shaved and put on a clean shirt worn through at the elbows, and in the lamplight the scar looked deeper, like a road on a map. He said he figured we ought to talk before the courthouse, set things straight. He told me he did not ask for this and did not want my ranch, and when I asked him plainly why he had agreed, he was quiet so long I thought he would not answer. Then he said he had been running from a thing back in the nations for 3 years, that he was tired down into his bones, and that this place offered him a reason to stop. He said something else too, quiet, looking out at the dark. He said my husband had once done him a kindness he had never been able to repay, and that maybe a man could pay a debt to the dead by standing good for the living. I did not understand what he meant. I thought it was just a thing a lonesome man says. I let it go, and that was my mistake, and it was the only one I am grateful for. We made the bargain at the corral with Preacher dozing between us. Marriage in law, not in truth. Separate rooms. The ranch stayed mine, my cattle, my spring, my say. He would take the room over the tack shed and work like any hand, and the town could believe whatever it liked. He agreed to all of it without an argument, which unsettled me more than arguing would have. Before he led his horse away, he stopped and said he was sorry about Daniel, that he had been a good man. I asked how a drifter would know that. Levi said, folks talk, and a man can tell good from a grave a mile off. Then he went to the tack shed, and I went to my empty bed, and somewhere out in the dark, a coyote was singing about the dryness of the world. The vows took less time than boiling coffee. Judge read out of his Bible like he was reading a feed bill. The clerk signed as witness. Vernon Tate sneered from the back, and Harlan Pike did not come at all, which told me he thought he had already won. When it came time for the ring, Levi took a thin gold band from his vest and said it had been his mother's, and I needn't keep it past the day. But when he slid it on my finger, it weighed more than gold ought to, and I knew the thing was real now, that I was Ruth Hart in the eyes of the law and would never be just Ruth Calloway again. The judge said Levi could kiss the bride. Levi leaned in and his lips barely touched my cheek, more apology than affection, and even that small thing went through me like a struck match, and I despised myself for it with my husband 3 weeks dead. The days after were dust and silence and burnt biscuits. I have always been a fair cook, but those first mornings my hands would not behave and I scorched the biscuits black 2 days running. Levi ate everyone without a word, dunking them in his coffee to soften the char, and on the 3rd morning I caught the corner of his mouth twitch and I dared him to say something. He said, I've eaten worse, Mrs. Hart. Ate my own boot leather one winter in the nations. I told him a man who ate his boots had no business judging biscuits, and that was the first time either of us laughed since the courthouse. It did not last. There was too much between us and too little water, and a snake of a man counting the days until the note came due. Preacher made himself a part of every chore. That mule had one milky blind eye and a heart full of pure contrariness. He would carry a load of wire halfway to the south fence and then plant all 4 feet and refuse God and man to take another step. And the only thing that ever moved him was the smell of a coming storm, when he would suddenly trot off bold as a general toward the very thing every other animal feared. Levi said the mule had it backward, that he ran toward weather and away from work. I said the mule and I had that in common. Levi looked at me when I said it and did not smile, but something moved behind his eyes, and I went back to the biscuits to keep from looking at him too long. The real trouble started at the spring. One morning Cyrus came in white-faced and said the cattle were drinking shy at the lower pool, and when Levi and I rode out, we found dead grass crusted around the edge and 3 calves down sick in the mud. Somebody had dumped poison in the lower catch where the water pooled before it ran onto the herd, not the spring head itself, which was too well guarded by the rocks, but enough to make the message plain. Levi knelt in the mud and worked it through his fingers and said it was a slow poison, meant to sicken and scare, not to kill the water outright, because Pike wanted the spring alive when he took it. We spent 2 days and a night digging a new channel to carry the clean water around the fouled pool, working side by side in the dark with lanterns, our hands raw, and somewhere in those 2 days, the silence between us changed its shape. It stopped being a wall and started being a room we were both standing in. He told me about the nations a little. I told him about Daniel a lot. By the second dawn, I knew the sound of his breathing well enough to find him in a dark barn. Vernon Tate brought the next message himself, with 4 men, the week the note came due. They came at dusk and cut a 1/4 mile of my south fence and shot one of my best steers and left it bloating in the dust as a calling card. Levi rode out to meet them alone before I could stop him, and Cyrus and I watched from the windmill platform with rifles while 5 men beat one. They did not use guns. Pike wanted Levi alive and shamed, not dead and martyred. They worked him over with fists and a rope and a rifle butt, and Levi did not run and did not beg, and when they finally rode off laughing he was still on his feet, swaying, one eye swelling shut, blood in his teeth. I got down off that windmill and ran to him, and I was angrier than I had ever been in my life, angrier than I was the day they read me the law. I cleaned his face at the kitchen table with my hands shaking, and I told him he was a fool, that he could have run, that none of this was his fight. He caught my wrist, gentle, and held it, and he said, "It's my fight now. I married into it." And I looked at him, beaten and bloody and stubborn as preacher, and I felt the thing I had been refusing to feel rise up in me like the spring rising out of the rock. That night the dry lightning came. We do not get rain on the Llano in a drought, but we get the lightning anyway, great silent forks of it walking the horizon with no thunder behind, the air gone thick and metal tasting. I could not sleep, and neither could he. I found him on the porch watching the sky burn and not strike, and I stood beside him close enough to feel the heat of his arm. I reached up without deciding to and touched the scar on his neck, and he went still as stone but did not pull away. I asked if it hurt. He said only when the weather changed. I said the weather was changing now. He turned, and his face was half in shadow and half in lightning, and his hand came up to my jaw, and for one long breath the whole prairie held its tongue. Then preacher brayed loud enough to wake the dead and went trotting off toward the lightning bold as you please, and we both jerked back laughing and shaking, and the moment broke clean in 2. I went to my room and pressed my back against the door and stood there a long time with my hand on my own mouth, asking myself what in God's name I thought I was doing. The note came due, and Harlan Pike did not send men. He sent the law. He had the water rights hearing moved up and packed the courthouse, and he meant to take the spring in broad daylight with the judge's blessing, the cleanest theft a man ever pulled. But Pike made the mistake greedy men always make. He thought because I was a woman and a widow I would come to that hearing weeping. I came with a tin box. Daniel had been a careful man, careful the way a lawman gets after he has seen what carelessness costs. The night before the hearing I had finally found the courage to open the floorboard under our bed where he kept his private papers, and inside the tin box was the original deed to the ranch and the spring, surveyed and filed and stamped by the Territorial Land Office 4 years gone, free of any lien, any note, any debt to any man. And there was something better. There was the surveyor's own field book, with the date Pike's forged note claimed Daniel borrowed the money. And on that exact date, the survey book put Daniel 200 miles east in Fort Worth, signing the deed in front of 3 witnesses whose names were all still living. I stood up in that crowded courtroom, and I laid the deed on the table next to Pike's ledger, and I let the judge and every soul in Caldwell Springs look at the two signatures side by side, the real one and the forged one, the little tale on the sea that my husband never made. I read out the date of the false note, and then I read out the surveyor's entry putting Daniel in Fort Worth that same day, and I asked Harlan Pike how a man could borrow $2,000 in a town he was 200 miles away from. The room went so quiet I could hear the windmill creaking outside. Pike's face came apart slow, the snake smile sliding off it, and I saw for the first time that under all that soft preacher's confidence, he was just a frightened, greedy old man who had reached for one thing too many. The judge took the deed in his hands and looked at it a long while, and then he looked at Pike, and he said the note was void, and the matter was closed, and Mr. Pike could expect a visit from a federal man about the forgery. The town that had been so quick to marry me off like livestock now would not meet my eye, and I found I did not care one bit what any of them thought. Levi was waiting for me in the wagon outside, and I climbed up beside him still trembling with the size of what I had done. He looked at me with something in his face I had not seen before, a kind of wonder, and he said, "You walked in there and beat him with a tin box." I said we beat him. He said no, that one was all mine. And then I did the thing I had been refusing to do since the night of the lightning. I took his battered face in both my hands, scar and bruise and all, and I kissed him in the full light of the afternoon with half the town watching through the courthouse windows. It was nothing like the chaste sweetness I had known with Daniel in our courting days. It was dry grass and a struck match. It was two people who had been alone too long finding they did not have to be, and I swear the whole prairie behind us caught fire with it. When we pulled apart, we were both breathing like we had run a mile, and Levi said, soft, "Ruth," and that was all, just my name, and it was enough. I should have known a man like Harlan Pike does not lose quiet. We had the law and the deed and the town turning our way, and I let myself believe for one whole night that it was over. We sat on the porch in the dark, and I asked Levi if he had any regrets. He said none. I said I had one, that it had taken me so long. That became our small ritual after, the question and the answer, though neither of us knew yet how many times we would have to mean it. The next afternoon the wind came up hard out of the west, hot and dry and steady, the kind of wind that makes the dead grass whisper like it is afraid. And then Preacher started screaming in the corral and would not stop, running the fence and pointing his blind eye to the west, and I came out to see what had spooked him, and I saw the smoke. Harlan Pike had taken a torch to the dry grass at the western edge of my land, upwind, with that hot wind to carry it. If he could not own the spring, he would burn the ranch off the face of the earth and the spring with it, and likely half of Caldwell Springs besides, for the fire did not care whose name was on the deed. The flame came across the lawn faster than a horse can run, a wall of it taller than the windmill, throwing up burning grass and burning birds, and the cattle in the home pasture went mad with it. Levi was already in the saddle. He shouted for Cyrus to drive the herd toward the spring branch where the green mesquite ran, the only firebreak we had, and he shouted at me to ride for town and warn them. But I had spent 3 weeks watching men decide what I would do, and I was finished with it. I cut Preacher loose, and that fool mule, who ran from fences and toward storms, ran straight at the fire with me on his back like he had been born for exactly this one terrible day. Here is the thing about a prairie fire. You cannot outrun it and you cannot fight it head on. What you can do is burn a strip of grass between the fire and the thing you love, a black scar with nothing left to feed the flame, so when the wall reaches it, the wall starves. Levi knew it from the rangering, and I knew it from Daniel, and we worked that line together with the whole sky orange above us, dragging burning brush along a plowed furrow, choking on smoke, our faces black, while Cyrus and every hand we had pushed the bawling herd into the green ribbon of the spring. A burning ember caught my sleeve, and Levi was off his horse and beating it out with his bare hands before I felt the pain. A steer went down between us in the smoke, and we hauled it up by main strength and turned it toward the water. And somewhere in all that hell, with the heat blistering my face and Preacher steady as a church under me, I understood the thing I think Daniel had been trying to teach me all along on those quiet evenings on the porch. You cannot own land like this. You cannot own the water or the grass or the wide, indifferent sky. You can only tend it, fight for it, and hope it is good to you in return. And the same was true, I knew now, of the man working the fire line beside me. We held the break, just barely, with the wind shifting at the last by the grace of God or the spite of it. The fire reached our black strip and the green mesquite and the cold water, and it starved and lay down and died in a smoking ruin 100 yards from my house. We saved the herd, every head but a dozen. We saved the spring. The men from town, who had seen the smoke and finally found their courage, rode out and helped us beat the last of it dead. And when it was over, we all stood in the black ash under a brown sky, too tired to speak. Harlan Pike did not get away. The fire he set turned on him the way greed always turns on the man who feeds it. His horse went down in a draw he thought was safe, and they found him after, and there is no need to say more about a man who burns a country to spite a widow. It was in the smoking quiet of that evening, sitting on the porch step with my burned arm wrapped in one of Daniel's old shirts, that Levi finally told me the truth he had been carrying since the courthouse. He had not drifted into Caldwell Springs by chance. Daniel had written him. The two of them had ridden together as Texas Rangers years before I ever met my husband, and Levi was the man Daniel had pulled out of a river once when a thing went bad in the nations, the kindness Levi had spoken of and never been able to repay. Daniel had a lawman's nose for his own death, and 3 months before the end he had sent a letter east to his old partner. The letter said only this, that if anything happened to him, would Levi come west and see that no man took advantage of Ruth. Levi had been on his way to do exactly that, to quietly watch over a stranger's widow out of love for a dead friend, when the drought and the debt and the law had forced him into a marriage neither of us chose. He had not told me because he could not stand for me to think he had married me out of obligation to a ghost. I sat with that a long time, watching the moon come up red through the smoke. I thought I would feel cheated, that the whole thing had been arranged by my husband from beyond the grave, the way Pike had tried to arrange it for his own pocket. But I did not feel cheated. I felt held. Daniel had reached out of his grave not to trap me but to make sure I was not alone, and the man he had chosen had turned out to be a man I would have chosen myself, given a free hand and time enough. I told Levi that Pike forced us together, but Daniel did not, and neither did the law. We had done the choosing ourselves every day since, over scorched biscuits and a contrary mule and a poisoned pool and a wall of fire. I asked him if he had any regrets. He said none. I told him neither did I, and this time I knew it all the way down. We married again 2 weeks later, in the burned-over yard with the first green shoots of new grass already pushing up through the black ash, which is a thing the llano does. It has to burn before it can come back greener than before. I wore my mother's dress, let out and let down to fit. Cyrus stood up as witness and cried into his hat and pretended it was the smoke still in his eyes. Half the town came, the same half that had whispered, and I let them, because forgiveness is cheaper than spite, and I had spent enough on enemies. This time when the preacher said Levi could kiss the bride, there was no apology in it, none at all. He lifted me clean off my feet, and the people laughed and the cattle bawled down by the spring, and preacher brayed his fool head off, and the prairie that had burned for us now bloomed for us instead. A year on, I am writing this from the porch Daniel built, with my hand resting on a belly grown round with a child that will be born into spring water and green grass and a name freely given. We planted peach trees on the south rise, in the soil the fire fed, and they have taken root. The spring runs as cold and clear as ever, and we do not own it, no matter what the deed says in town. We tend it, the way you tend everything you love, and it is good to us in return. Levi is out in the corral now, losing an argument with that one-eyed mule, and the sound of his cussing carries up to me on the evening wind sweeter than any hymn. Daniel rests on the hill where the new grass is tallest, and I go up there sometimes and tell him the news, and I am not sorry, only grateful that a good man loved me enough to make sure I would be loved again. The sheriff's widow became the cowboy's reluctant bride by force and by ink, and by the cruelty of a dry year. But the woman who sits on this porch tonight, watching her husband and her mule and her unborn child and the trees the fire gave her, is no man's bargain and no law's property. She is only tending what she loves, the way she always meant to, under the wide and patient sky that owns us all and is owned by none.